The air in the grand ballroom of the St. Regis crackled with the energy of 1,000 champagne bubbles and 1,000,000 hushed ambitions. At the center of it all stood Marcus Thorne, a man who wore his success like a tailored suit, expensive, sharp, and a little too tight. Beside him, clinging to his arm, was Chloe Vanderbilt, her laughter a high, glittering sound that grated on the nerves. Marcus was telling a story, his voice booming over the string quartet, a story of conquest and power. And across the room his wife Isabella watched it all. She was supposed to be a ghost tonight, a beautiful, silent accessory. But they didn't know her secret. They didn't know who she was walking in with. In just a few moments, the man bragging about owning the world was about to find out his wife was the one who could take it all away. Isabella Rossi stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in her cavernous walk-in closet, a space larger than the apartment she'd grown up in. The dress she wore was a deep sapphire silk, a custom piece by Oscar de la Renta that Marcus had insisted upon. It was beautiful, a cage of exquisite craftsmanship that felt both priceless and worthless at the same time, like her marriage. For 5 years she had been Mrs. Marcus Thorne. In the beginning, it was a whirlwind. He was a charming, ambitious real estate developer on the rise, and she was a bright architectural student with dreams as big as the city skyline. He'd loved her mind, her passion, her unique perspective on space and light. He used to say she was his secret weapon, the brilliant eye that saw what others missed. She had helped him quietly behind the scenes, refining blueprints, suggesting materials, turning his good ideas into great ones. And he had soared. But with every new skyscraper that bore the name Thorne Development, the man she married chipped away, replaced by a caricature of wealth. The loving whispers turned into dismissive scoffs. Her dabbles in architecture, as he now called them, became a source of condescension. "It's a cute hobby, Izzy," he'd said just last week, not looking up from his phone. "Keeps you busy while I do the real work." The real work tonight was the grand launch party for the Olympian. His crowning achievement, a 90-story luxury residential tower that pierced the heart of downtown. It was his night to be king, and he required his queen to be present, silent and smiling. "Are you ready yet?" Marcus's voice barked from the bedroom. He appeared in the mirror behind her, already straightening his Tom Ford tuxedo. He didn't look at her, but at her reflection, his eyes critically scanning the dress, the jewelry, the professionally styled hair. It was an inspection, not a loving gaze. "Almost," she said, her voice a soft murmur. She clasped the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. It felt cold and heavy, a gift from last year, offered as a perfunctory apology after she'd found receipts for a hotel she knew they'd never stayed at together. "Try to look happy tonight, Isabella," he said, adjusting his cufflinks. "A lot of important people will be there. My investors, the press. I don't need you looking like a pallbearer at my triumph." "It is your triumph, Marcus. I wouldn't dream of taking away your spotlight," she replied, a subtle edge to her tone that he completely missed. He finally met her eyes in the mirror, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means congratulations," she said, smoothly turning to face him. "You've worked hard." He seemed to relax, taking her answer as the deference he expected. "Damn right I have. This is just the beginning. Tonight everyone is going to see what real power looks like." He gave her a once-over, then smirked. "You clean up well. Let's go. Don't want to be late to my own party." He walked out without her. He always walked a few steps ahead, as if she were a page in his entourage rather than his partner. Isabella took one last look in the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked like a stranger, a perfectly polished doll. But beneath the silken diamonds, a fire was building. For months, she had been planning her escape. Not by running away, but by building her own empire in the shadows he cast. For 2 years, while Marcus believed she was managing their social calendar and doodling in her home office, she had been working. She'd quietly taken on freelance projects under a pseudonym, building a portfolio of breathtakingly innovative designs. Her break came 6 months ago, a response to a blind submission for a confidential project by a notoriously private but legendary firm, Blackwood Holdings. She'd won. For the last 6 months, she had been leading a secret team, designing the most ambitious architectural project the city had seen in a century. She reported directly to the firm's enigmatic CEO, a man who valued talent above all else, Damien Blackwood. He knew her only as I, Rossi the prodigy who existed only through encrypted video calls and flawless digital renderings. He had no idea she was the wife of the flashy, arrogant developer he was mildly acquainted with. Tonight, at Marcus's request, Mr. Blackwood would be the guest of honor. And tonight, at Mr. Blackwood's request, Rossi would be revealed. Isabella took a deep breath, the scent of her perfume, a fragrance Marcus had picked out, filling her lungs. It smelled like subjugation. After tonight, she would never wear it again. She walked out of the closet, her heels clicking decisively on the marble floor. It was time to go to the party. Her party. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis was a testament to Marcus's ego. Ice sculptures carved into the shape of the Olympian tower dripped onto pristine white linen. A string quartet played Vivaldi with a desperate fervor, as if trying to drown out the cacophony of self-important chatter. Waiters navigated the throng with silver trays of champagne and ludicrously small appetizers. As predicted, the moment they stepped through the ornate double doors, Marcus released her arm, as if it were on fire. "Mingle," he commanded, before being swallowed by a crowd of sycophants, eager to praise the king. Isabella was left standing alone in the entryway, a beautiful ship adrift in a sea of sharks. She watched him for a moment. He was magnetic, she had to admit. He laughed, shook hands, patted backs, his charisma, a weapon he wielded with lethal precision. Then she saw her. Chloe Vanderbilt materialized at his side, seemingly out of thin air. She was everything Isabella wasn't. Blonde where Isabella was brunette, loud where she was quiet, her red dress a slash of scarlet in the muted palette of the room. She looped her arm through Marcus's, a gesture of possessive intimacy that was a slap in the face. Marcus didn't pull away. In fact, he leaned in, whispering something in Chloe's ear that made her throw her head back and laugh, a sound that carried across the room. They were a portrait of public infidelity, so brazen it was almost theatrical. Everyone saw it. The whispers started instantly, a ripple of gossip spreading through the room. People glanced at Isabella, some with pity, some with morbid curiosity, others with a cruel smirk. She had endured this humiliation for months, the discreet lunches that became public dinners, the business trips that coincided with Chloe's social media posts from tropical locations. Tonight was different. Tonight, their disrespect was the fuel she needed. Isabella held her head high, took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, and moved gracefully through the room. She ignored the stares, the whispers. She was an actress playing her final scene as the docile wife. She exchanged pleasantries with a few business acquaintances who were polite enough to speak to her. Their conversations stilted their eyes, constantly darting back to the spectacle of Marcus and his mistress. She found a quiet alcove near a set of French doors leading to a balcony. From here, she had a clear view of her husband. He was holding court, Chloe still attached to him, a preening bird with borrowed feathers. "He's finally done it," Marcus's voice boomed intentionally, loud enough to capture the attention of anyone within a 20-foot radius. "The city's most exclusive address. The penthouse is sold for a record-breaking figure. You have to be a certain kind of person to live in the Olympian. Someone with vision, with ambition." "Someone like you, darling," Chloe purred loud enough for all to hear. She ran a perfectly manicured finger down the lapel of his jacket. "You're a force of nature." "We're a force of nature," he corrected, squeezing her hand. The "we" hung in the air, a deliberate, and brutal exclusion of the woman who legally shared his name. A portly man in a pinstripe suit, one of Marcus's investors, clapped him on the shoulder. "You've got the Midas touch thorn, and a fine eye for assets." He winked, his gaze sliding over Chloe. Isabella's grip on her champagne flute tightened. Her knuckles were white. She watched Chloe lean in and kiss Marcus on the cheek, leaving a smear of red lipstick. He didn't wipe it off. He wore it like a badge of honor. "You know," Chloe said, her voice dripping with manufactured sweetness as she addressed the group. But her eyes found Isabella across the room. "It takes a special kind of woman to stand by a man like Marcus. One who understands the sacrifices required for greatness. Someone who isn't holding him back with trivial little hobbies." The barb was aimed directly at Isabella, and it hit its mark. A few people in the circle snickered. Marcus just grinned, a cruel, self-satisfied expression on his face. He saw Isabella watching them, and for a fleeting moment, their eyes met. There was no shame in his, no remorse, only a cold, dismissive challenge. "What are you going to do about it?" Isabella held his gaze. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Instead, she gave him the smallest, most enigmatic smile, and then turned her back on him completely. The dismissal was so subtle, so total, that it seemed to momentarily throw him off. He frowned, his bravado faltering for just a second. She stepped out onto the balcony, the cool night air a welcome relief from the suffocating heat of the ballroom. The city skyline glittered before her, a web of infinite light. Her city. She looked for the construction site, the dark silhouette of a new tower just beginning its ascent into the heavens. Her tower. A quiet presence joined her on the balcony. She didn't have to turn to know who it was. The atmosphere had shifted, charged with a quiet authority that cut through the noise of the party. A rather ostentatious display, a deep, calm voice observed. Isabella turned. Damian Blackwood stood there, a figure of understated elegance in a simple, perfectly cut black suit. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with silver hair at his temples and eyes that seemed to see everything. He held a glass of scotch, the amber liquid catching the light. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice even. "I trust you're enjoying the party." "I'm enduring it, Miss Rosie," he corrected with a slight smile. "I'm not one for peacocks. I prefer eagles." His gaze flickered back into the ballroom towards Marcus. "Your husband has built a tall building. It remains to be seen if he has built a lasting one." He looked at her, then his expression unreadable. "Are you ready?" Isabella looked at the glittering city, then at the man who had given her a chance when no one else would. She thought of Marcus's smug face, of Chloe's mocking laughter. The humiliation, the years of being belittled and dismissed, coalesced into a single point of cold, hard resolve. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I'm ready." Damien Blackwood was a name whispered with reverence in the worlds of architecture and high finance, while men like Marcus Thorne built shiny towers that screamed for attention. Damien Blackwood built legacies. Blackwood Holdings was a global titan known for its groundbreaking sustainable designs and its almost mythical reputation for ethical business. To be praised by him was to be anointed. To be hired by him was to have your career set in stone. Marcus had been trying to get a meeting with Damien for over a year, his calls and emails consistently deflected by a polite but impenetrable wall of executive assistants. Damien's presence tonight was the ultimate validation, a sign that Marcus had finally ascended to the big leagues. He had secured it through a board member he'd spent months courting, and he was determined not to waste the opportunity. From his vantage point, Marcus watched with mounting irritation as his wife, his quiet, inconsequential wife, conversed with the most powerful man in the room. What on earth could Isabella be talking about with Damien Blackwood? Art charity balls. He felt a surge of possessive anger. She was embarrassing him. She had no place in that world, no right to take up the valuable time of a man he so desperately needed to impress. Chloe noticed his focus. "Who's that your wife is talking to?" she asked, a hint of jealousy in her voice. She couldn't stand the idea of any woman, especially Isabella, commanding the attention of such a distinguished-looking man. "That's Damien Blackwood," Marcus gritted out, "the CEO of Blackwood Holdings. The man is a living legend." "Well, what does he want with her?" Chloe scoffed. "Is she boring him with stories about her little garden?" "I'm going to put a stop to this," Marcus said, his jaw tight. He started to move towards the balcony, a storm cloud of indignation. But before he could take 2 steps, Damien and Isabella turned and walked back into the ballroom together. They weren't talking anymore. Damien was leading the way, and Isabella followed a step behind her, expression serene and composed. It looked formal, professional. It confused him. Damien headed straight for the small group of investors Marcus had been entertaining. Marcus quickly changed his trajectory, intercepting them with a wide, artificial smile plastered on his face. "Damien, so glad you could make it. I see you've met my wife, Isabella," Marcus said, placing a heavy, proprietary hand on Isabella's shoulder. She subtly shifted, shrugging it off without making a scene. "We were just getting acquainted," Damien said smoothly, his eyes holding a twinkle that Marcus couldn't decipher. "Your wife is a woman of remarkable depth." Marcus laughed, a loud, forced sound. "Oh, Izzy's full of surprises. A true artist at heart. But I'm the one who builds the canvases for the city." He gestured expansively at the room. "What do you think of what we've done with the Olympian?" "It's a bold statement," Damien replied, his tone neutral. It was a diplomat's answer, offering neither praise nor criticism. For a man like Marcus, who craved adulation, it was almost an insult. "Bold is my middle name," Marcus boasted. "We're already scouting locations for the next one. Something bigger, taller, a true monument." He was practically salivating at the prospect of impressing Damien, of maybe even luring him into a future partnership. Isabella remained silent during the exchange, a silent observer at her own husband's side. She watched Marcus puff up his chest, his desperation for approval so palpable it was pathetic. He didn't even look at her. In his mind, she had served her purpose by being a temporary link to Damien, and was now expected to fade back into the wallpaper. "If you'll excuse me," Damien said, giving a slight nod to Marcus, but directing a more meaningful look at Isabella. I have some people I need to speak with before the main event." He moved away, leaving a vacuum of power in his wake. The investors immediately closed in on Marcus again, but the energy had shifted. Damian Blackwood had spoken more to the wife than the husband, and in their world of subtle power plays that meant something. "What was that about?" Marcus hissed at Isabella, his smile gone the moment they were out of earshot of his investors. "We were discussing the view," Isabella said calmly, taking a sip of her champagne. "The view you were out there for 10 minutes. Don't play games with me, Isabella. You do not talk to a man like that unless I am present. You understand it's unseemly." "I understand that you feel threatened," she replied, her voice dangerously quiet. His eyes widened in fury. "Threatened by you? Don't be ridiculous. You're a housewife with a hobby. I'm the man who built that." He jabbed a thumb towards a massive, glittering portrait of the Olympian Tower. "Know your place." It was the same phrase his father used to say to his mother. The same phrase that had suffocated the life out of a brilliant woman until she was nothing more than a ghost in her own home. A cold dread followed by a wave of pure, liberating anger washed over Isabella. "Oh, Marcus," she said, and for the first time that night, she smiled a genuine, brilliant smile. It was sharp and terrifying. "I know my place. The question is, do you know yours?" Before he could process the sheer audacity of her statement, the lights dimmed and a hush fell over the room. The event manager stepped up to a podium on the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention. In a few moments we will hear from the man of the hour, the visionary behind the Olympian, Mr. Marcus Thorne." Applause rippled through the ballroom. Chloe reappeared, taking Marcus's hand and pulling him towards the stage, whispering words of encouragement in his ear. Marcus shot one last venomous glare at Isabella before plastering his public smile back on. His moment had arrived. Isabella stayed where she was, melting into the shadows at the edge of the room. The storm was no longer gathering. It was about to break. A spotlight found Marcus as he ascended the small stage, Chloe positioned strategically a few steps below him, like a handmaiden at the foot of a throne. He radiated smug satisfaction, soaking in the applause from the crowd of people who either depended on him, feared him, or wanted something from him. He tapped the microphone, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent ballroom. Thank you all for coming." He began, his voice smooth and practiced. "Tonight is not just about a building. It's about a vision of luxury, of power, of what our great city can become when ambition is unshackled." Isabella watched her heart, a steady rhythmic drum. She felt strangely calm, like an engineer watching a demolition she had meticulously planned. She saw Damian Blackwood, standing near the front of the stage. His expression impassive, a statue amidst the fawning crowd. Marcus launched into a self-congratulatory monologue, thanking his construction partners, his sales team, and his financial backers. He was charming and witty, playing the role of the maverick genius to perfection. "Building something like the Olympian?" he continued, his voice dropping to a more intimate, seemingly heartfelt tone. "It doesn't happen alone. It requires a support system. It requires a partner who shares your drive, who pushes you, who understands that greatness requires sacrifice." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the words hang in the air. His eyes scanned the crowd, deliberately skipping over Isabella, and landed on Chloe. He gave her a warm, appreciative smile, a smile he hadn't given his own wife in years. Chloe glowed under the attention, her eyes shining with triumph. "You need a partner who can keep up," Marcus declared, his voice rising again. Someone who isn't afraid to soar. In life, as in business, you have to be willing to shed dead weight to reach the summit. You have to surround yourself with people who match your ambition, who reflect your success. The insult was undeniable. It was a public execution of their marriage, a declaration that Isabella was the dead weight he was shedding. Gasps rippled through the room. People turned to stare openly at Isabella, their faces a mixture of shock and pitying glee. She felt hundreds of eyes on her, but she didn't shrink. She stood taller, her chin lifted. She met the gaze of a few of the women she knew, wives of Marcus's colleagues, women trapped in their own gilded cages, and saw a flicker of recognition of shared pain in their eyes. Marcus, drunk on his own power, was oblivious. He raised his glass. So I want to toast to the future, to bigger, bolder projects, to new partnerships, and to having the right people by your side. He winked in Chloe's direction. To the Olympian. To the Olympian. The crowd echoed the applause, thundering. Marcus basked in it, a conquering hero on his stage. He gestured for Chloe to join him, and she practically ran up the last 2 steps, linking her arm with his as they waved to the audience. They were the picture of a power couple, a public unveiling of their affair. The event manager returned to the podium. Thank you, Marcus, an inspiring vision. And now it is my distinct honor to introduce a true titan of industry, a man whose work has redefined cityscapes across the globe. He is a special guest tonight, and a testament to the importance of this project. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to the CEO of Blackwood Holdings, Mr. Damien Blackwood. Another wave of applause, this one. More reverent, more genuine, swept the room. Damien walked onto the stage with an unhurried, commanding grace. He shook Marcus's hand, a brief, formal gesture. Marcus was beaming, standing next to Damien, as an equal, the final confirmation of his arrival. Thank you, Damien said into the microphone, his voice calm and resonant, instantly commanding more authority than Marcus's booming had. Marcus, congratulations on your building. It is certainly tall. A few people who understood Damien's penchant for dry understatement chuckled. Marcus's smile tightened. I'm here tonight not just to celebrate one building, Damien continued, but to celebrate the future of architecture itself. Blackwood Holdings has always believed in pushing boundaries, in finding the visionaries who will shape the world of tomorrow. For the past year, we have been secretly developing our most ambitious project to date, a structure that will be a global icon of sustainable design and human ingenuity. We call it the Zenith Tower. A murmur of excitement went through the crowd. Rumors of this project had been circulating for months, but details were non-existent. A project of this magnitude, Damien said, his eyes scanning the room, requires a singular revolutionary talent. We conducted a global search, a blind competition, to find an architect whose vision was not just new but necessary. We found that person. Their designs are breathtaking. Their understanding of structural engineering and ecological harmony is unlike anything I have ever seen. This individual is a genius, and they are about to change our skyline forever. Marcus stood beside him looking smug, assuming this was all part of a grand preamble to a potential collaboration. He was already imagining the headlines, Thorn and Blackwood, a partnership of titans. Chloe looked bored, already planning her post-party celebration with Marcus. Damien paused, letting the anticipation build to a fever pitch. Tonight I am here to end the speculation. It is my profound pleasure to announce for the first time publicly the lead architect and chief visionary behind the Zenith Tower. He turned his gaze, sweeping past Marcus, past Chloe, and locking directly onto Isabella, who was now stepping out of the shadows. "Please join me in congratulating the brilliant mind behind it all. Ms. Isabella Rossi." The name dropped into the silent room like a stone into a perfectly still lake. Isabella Rossi. For a full 3 seconds there was nothing but a collective disbelieving silence. The string quartet had stopped playing. The waiters froze mid-stride. 1,000 champagne flutes were held suspended in the air. The first sound was a choked gasp. It came from Marcus. He froze. Utterly, completely, and comically frozen. The triumphant, smug grin was wiped from his face as if by a physical blow. His skin went pale, a sickly, chalky white under the stage lights. His eyes, wide with shock, darted from Damien Blackwood to the woman, walking calmly, purposefully towards the stage. It wasn't possible. It was a mistake. A joke. Izzy. His quiet, hobbyist wife Chloe's reaction was a mirror of his, but laced with a venomous disbelief. Her perfectly painted smile dissolved into an ugly snarl of confusion. Her head whipped between Isabella and Damien, the gears in her social climbing brain, grinding, failing to compute this impossible reality. Her grip on Marcus's arm went slack, and Isabella walked. She moved through the parted sea of stunned guests, each step a quiet declaration of independence. Her sapphire dress shimmered no longer a cage, but a suit of armor. Her expression was poised, serene, and utterly unreadable. She didn't look at the shocked faces, the whispering mouths. Her focus was on the stage, on the future that awaited her there. She looked powerful. She looked free. She reached the stairs, and Damien Blackwood, a true gentleman, stepped forward and offered her his hand. She took it, and he helped her onto the stage. She stood between the two men, the one who had tried to crush her and the one who had given her wings. The silence finally broke, replaced by a wave of frantic, excited murmuring. The puzzle pieces were slamming into place in everyone's mind. The long conversation on the balcony, Damien's cryptic remarks, Isabella's quiet composure in the face of her husband's public infidelity. It wasn't weakness, it was waiting. The gossip hounds, the investors, the socialites, they all understood power, and they could feel the world tilting on its axis. Isabella stepped up to the microphone Damien had gracefully ceded to her. She looked out at the sea of faces, and for the first time she allowed herself to meet the horrified gaze of her husband. She held it for just a beat, a silent checkmate, before turning her attention to the audience. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the ballroom. There was no trace of the timid, soft-spoken woman they thought they knew. This was the voice of a leader. "Thank you for your faith in my vision. The Zenith Tower is more than a building to me. It is a promise of a future where architecture serves humanity, not just ego, where sustainability is not an afterthought but the foundation. It will be a landmark not because of its height, but because of its harmony." She spoke for 2 minutes, outlining her philosophy with an eloquence and passion that held the entire room spellbound. She spoke of biomimetic design, of vertical gardens, of a net-zero energy system that would revolutionize urban development. She was brilliant. She was a star, being born right before their eyes. And she never once looked at Marcus again. He was invisible to her. He and Chloe stood frozen on the side of the stage, 2 statues in a tableau of public humiliation. The spotlight wasn't on them anymore. It was on Isabella. And it was blinding. When she finished, there was a beat of silence. And then the room erupted. The applause was deafening, a genuine thunderous roar of admiration that dwarfed the polite clapping Marcus had received. It was an ovation. Business leaders, city officials, rival developers, people Marcus had spent years trying to impress, were on their feet applauding his wife. Isabella smiled a real radiant smile and nodded her thanks. Damien Blackwood stood beside her, beaming like a proud mentor. He raised her hand in the air. "The future of architecture, ladies and gentlemen," he declared over the noise. Marcus Thorne, the man of the hour, had become a footnote at his own party. The reckoning was here, and it was just beginning. The thunderous applause that had greeted Isabella's announcement did not simply fade. It shattered, leaving behind a silence so profound it was almost louder than the noise it replaced. It was a vacuum charged with the electric hum of 1,000 calculations being made simultaneously. In that single suspended moment, social hierarchies were redrawn, allegiances were reassessed, and the entire power structure of the room was demolished and rebuilt around a new center of gravity. Isabella Rossi. On the stage, Marcus and Chloe were trapped in a harsh, unforgiving bubble of light. They were statues in a museum of their own failure. The crowd, which just moments ago had been their adoring audience, now looked past them as if they were inconvenient furniture. The digital wildfire had already begun. The glow of phone screens was everywhere. Fingers flying across keyboards, spreading the news of the most spectacular corporate immolation anyone had ever witnessed firsthand. Chloe was the first to break. Her carefully constructed facade of poised superiority crumbled into a mask of pure reptilian panic. "Marcus!" She hissed, her voice a venomous whisper that barely carried over the rising din of the crowd. Her manicured fingers dug into his arm like talons. "Do something, you look like an idiot. She's making a fool of you of us." Marcus didn't seem to hear her. His mind was a white noise machine of disbelief and fury. "Isabella. My Izzy." The name Rossi echoed in his skull. She had used her maiden name, a name he had worked so hard to erase and replace with his own. It was a declaration of war he hadn't even known was being waged. He replayed the last 2 years in his mind, a frantic, disjointed montage, her late nights in the study, which he'd dismissed as doodling, her hushed phone calls which he'd assumed were with decorators or charity organizers, her newfound confidence which he'd found irritatingly unfeminine. It hadn't been a hobby. It had been a coup planned and executed with military precision from inside the walls of his own home. He wasn't just betrayed. He was outsmarted, and the public nature of the revelation was the most exquisitely painful part of the torture. They stumbled off the stage, not walking, but being pushed by the sheer force of their own irrelevance. No one made way for them. They had to shoulder their way through clusters of people who pointedly turned their backs, suddenly engrossed in conversations. They were ghosts at their own feast. Across the room, Isabella was anything but a ghost. She was a supernova. A circle had formed around her, a collection of the city's most influential figures, all vying for her attention. Jonathan Croft, a rival developer who had once mockingly called Isabella Thorne's trophy, was now looking at her with an expression of raw, undisguised admiration. "Absolutely brilliant, Ms. Rossi," he said, pressing his business card into her hand. "If you ever decide to branch out, my door is always open." She handled the onslaught with a preternatural calm that unnerved Marcus more than any emotional outburst could have. She wasn't giddy with victory. She was simply in command. She accepted congratulations, deflected offers, and directed inquiries to a personal assistant, who Marcus realized with a fresh wave of nausea probably existed. Rage finally burned through the fog of his shock. He had to confront her. He had to regain control. He began to push his way toward her, a man swimming against a tidal wave of his own making. The crowd parted for him now, but not out of respect. It was with a morbid curiosity, the way one makes room for a car wreck. "Isabella," he barked, his voice raw. The vibrant circle around her fell silent. She turned to face him, her expression one of polite inquiry, as if he were a slightly bothersome stranger. "Marcus." She acknowledged, her tone level and cool. "Is there something you need?" The condescension in her simple question lit his fuse. "I need to talk to you, now, in private," he demanded, his voice low and threatening. A small, pitying smile touched her lips. "I'm afraid my schedule is quite full for the foreseeable future," she replied, her voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "But I'm sure my lawyer can find a time to speak with your lawyer." "Don't do this, Izzy," he said, his anger giving way to a desperate plea. "What have you done? You've destroyed everything." "No, Marcus," she corrected him, her voice dropping, but losing none of its steel. "You destroyed everything. You just thought you were destroying me. You stood on that stage next to that woman, and you called me dead weight. You bragged about shedding me to reach the summit. You were so blinded by your own reflection, you couldn't see you were standing on a trap door you built yourself." Before he could form a reply, a distinguished silver-haired man in a dark, impeccably tailored suit stepped forward, holding a sleek leather folio. He moved with a quiet authority that cut through the drama. "Ms. Rossi?" he inquired. "Mr. Albright," Isabella said, turning her back on her husband as if he had ceased to exist. "Thank you for your patience." The lawyer, Mr. Albright, didn't even glance at Marcus. He simply opened the folio and produced a thick sheaf of documents. He took one step toward Marcus, who instinctively recoiled. "Mr. Thorne," the lawyer said, his voice a flat, unemotional instrument of finality. "You are being served." He placed the documents into Marcus's numb hand. The top page was stark and official. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Marcus stared at the words, his vision blurring. But Isabella wasn't finished. She leaned in her voice, a chilling, conspiratorial whisper, meant only for him. "That's just the personal matter, Marcus. There's also the business." She let the silence hang for a moment. "You were so desperate for capital 6 months ago. You were bleeding money, about to lose everything before the Olympian was even finished. Then, like a miracle, an anonymous offshore entity came in and bought a controlling 51% stake in your debt. Do you remember?" His blood turned to ice. It had been his salvation, the secret deal that had allowed him to finish the project and host this very party. "That entity," Isabella continued, her voice as sharp and cold as a shard of glass, "is a wholly owned subsidiary of Blackwood Holdings, and Damien, as you know, is a stickler for details. You should have read the fine print in that contract you were so eager to sign. There's a rather stringent morals clause." She watched the dawning abject horror spread across his face. "It stipulates," she recited, as if from memory, "that any public act of malfeasance, disrepute, or gross personal misconduct by the primary officers of Thorne Development that could damage the reputation of the project or its investors constitutes an immediate and total default. Standing on a stage and publicly humiliating your wife, who, as it turns out, is the lead architect of your primary investor's new flagship project, is, I believe, the very definition of gross personal misconduct." He finally looked up from the divorce papers, his eyes wide with the terror of a man who has just realized he's in a freefall. The trap was perfect. His own words, his own grandstanding, his own ego. They were the keys that had locked him in and thrown away the key. He was ruined, utterly and completely. Why? The word was a choked, pathetic rasp, the last gasp of a dying empire. Isabella looked at him, and for the first time she let him see the cold, burning fire behind her calm facade. "You told me to know my place, Marcus," she said, her voice a final, devastating verdict. "And I finally took your advice. My place is at the top. You just happened to be in the way." She turned without another word and walked away, rejoining Damien Blackwood at the edge of the crowd. Together they moved toward the exit, the sea of guests parting for them like the waters before a king and queen. Marcus Thorne was left standing alone in the center of the grand ballroom, a solitary island in a sea of his own making, clutching the twin testaments to his annihilation. The fallout was not a storm, it was a changing of the climate. As Isabella and Damien Blackwood departed the grand ballroom, they left behind a vacuum that was instantly filled with the frantic, high-pitched buzz of scandal. Marcus Thorne, the man who had stood on stage just minutes before as a king surveying his kingdom, was now a pariah in his own palace. He stood alone, the divorce papers, a flimsy, damning piece of evidence in his trembling hand. The air around him was thick with whispers, the pitying and scornful glances of his guests, feeling like physical blows. The party, his grand triumph, had become the public stage for his execution. His walk out of the St. Regis was the longest of his life. Every eye was on him. He could feel the glow of 100 smartphone screens pointed in his direction, capturing his disgrace for digital posterity. He found Chloe by the valet stand, her face a thunderous mask of rage and panic. "What was that?" she shrieked the moment the doors of his Rolls-Royce closed, her voice stripping away any pretense of sophistication. "She set us up. Marcus, she set me up. My face is everywhere. I'm going to be a laughing stock. Be quiet, Chloe." He mumbled, his mind a static-filled void. He couldn't process her concerns. They were like mosquito bites during a heart attack. "Quiet. Quiet," she screamed. "That witch just torpedoed your entire life, which, in case you've forgotten, I am a part of. You told me she was nothing, a boring little housewife with a sketchbook. You said she was dead weight. You have to fix this. Sue her. Annul the marriage. Something." But Marcus knew it was over. He had seen the look in Isabella's eyes. It wasn't anger or hatred. It was something far more terrifying indifference. It was the look one gives to a problem that has already been solved and filed away. The next morning, the climate change became a Category 5 hurricane. The story was the lead item on every financial news network, the front page of every business journal. Forbes ran a profile titled "The Architect's Gambit: How Isabella Rossi Built a Secret Empire." The Wall Street Journal was more direct. "Thorne's Tower topples under hubris and a hostile takeover." They painted Isabella as a modern-day heroine, a brilliant mind who had endured her husband's infidelity and condescension while quietly outmaneuvering him at every turn. They painted him as a caricature of toxic ambition, a corporate Icarus who had flown too close to a son he never realized was his own wife. At 9:00 a.m., sharp, a team of lawyers from Blackwood Holdings arrived at his office. They were not aggressive or loud. Their quiet, surgical precision was far more brutal. They laid out the terms of the morals clause in excruciating detail, cross-referencing his on-stage comments, which were now transcribed and trending on social media with the specific contractual language. His investors, represented by Blackwood, had already voted unanimously to invoke the clause. Thorn Development's assets were frozen. Its board was dissolved. Marcus was informed that security would escort him from the premises after he collected his personal belongings. A single small box was all he was allowed. His financial ruin was as swift as it was total. The investor lawsuits piled up, each one a nail in his corporate coffin. The banks called in their loans. The credit cards were declined. The Rolls-Royce was repossessed from the curb outside his building. He returned to the penthouse to find Chloe frantically stuffing designer bags into Louis Vuitton luggage. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice hollow. Away from this disaster, she spat, not even looking at him. "I have a reputation to think about. I can't be associated with this failure. I gave you everything, Chloe." He pleaded, a pathetic edge to his voice. "The condo, the car, the jewelry." She finally turned to face him, her eyes cold and reptilian. "You gave me things, Marcus, that's all. It was a transaction. And right now, your stock has plummeted to 0. You have nothing left to offer." She gestured around the opulent penthouse. "Enjoy it while it lasts. I hear foreclosures are quite the process." She walked out, leaving him alone in the cavernous apartment that was no longer his. The sharp click of her heels on the marble floor, a final punctuating insult. He was adrift. The sycophants who had filled his phone with fawning texts went silent. The friends he'd bought with expensive dinners and VIP access suddenly had no time for him. He was forced to sell what little he had left. Watches, art cufflinks to pay his legal fees, and secure a small, generic apartment in a nondescript part of the city. It was a sterile beige box that smelled of cheap paint, a stark contrast to the life of bespoke luxury he had taken for granted. The silence was the worst part. It was a crushing, heavy blanket, broken only by the sound of his own thoughts replaying his downfall on an endless, torturous loop. Meanwhile, Isabella ascended. She gave one and only one interview to Architectural Digest. She was poised, articulate, and magnanimous. When asked about Marcus, she simply said, "We had a life together, and now we don't. My focus is on the work ahead." She spoke with such passion and brilliance about the Zenith Tower, her vision for a sustainable urban future, that she became an overnight icon. She was a symbol of quiet strength, of intellectual superiority, of a woman who had refused to be erased. Her life became a whirlwind of productive, exhilarating work. She was in the office before dawn, not out of obligation, but out of pure, unadulterated passion. Her days were filled with meetings where engineers, urban planners, and financiers hung on her every word. She led her team with a collaborative spirit that was the antithesis of Marcus's autocratic style, fostering an environment where innovation thrived. She had found her place not by her husband's side, but at the head of a table she had built herself. 6 months after the party, the divorce was finalized. Isabella had requested none of Marcus's frozen assets, a move that only solidified her legend. She didn't need a single cent from his shattered empire. On a crisp autumn afternoon, she stood on the 50th floor of the Zenith Tower's steel skeleton, donning a hard hat over her perfectly styled hair, and a tailored pantsuit that was both practical and powerful. She surveyed the city. The wind howled through the open framework, a wild and liberating song. Below her, the metropolis sprawled out a complex tapestry of lives and dreams. From this height, even the Olympian, once the center of her husband's universe, seemed diminished just one shiny building among many. She thought of Marcus not with anger, but with a profound and distant sadness. He had been given every advantage, every opportunity. Yet his ego had been a self-destruct mechanism. He saw success as a zero-sum game, a conquest. He never understood that the strongest structures are built not to dominate, but to harmonize. A quiet presence came to stand beside her. Damien Blackwood, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee, looked out at the view. His expression was one of deep satisfaction. "He doesn't understand, does he?" Damien said, as if reading her mind. "Understand what?" Isabella asked. "That you didn't do this to him." Damien clarified, his wise eyes fixed on the horizon. "You did this for you. His downfall was just the collateral damage of your rise. He was a wall you had to go through to get to where you were always meant to be." Isabella considered his words. He was right. Her plan had never been about revenge. It had been about survival, about reclaiming the person she had almost lost. "I spent 5 years helping him lay the foundation for his legacy," she said softly, more to herself than to Damien. "It never occurred to me. I should be laying my own." "A foundation is everything," Damien agreed. "Without a solid one, anything built on top, no matter how tall or shiny, is destined to collapse." Isabella took a sip of her coffee, the warmth spreading through her. She looked at the raw concrete beneath her boots, the powerful steel beams reaching for the clouds around her. This was her foundation. It was built not on a marriage contract or social status, but on her own talent, her own resilience, her own unbreakable will. The wind picked up, pulling at her coat, but she stood firm, unmovable. The woman who had once been a silent accessory in a gilded cage was now the architect of the skyline, and her greatest work was just beginning. That's where Isabella's story of rebirth truly begins, and where Marcus's cautionary tale ends. It's a powerful reminder that the brightest lights are often forced to shine in the darkest shadows before they can finally be seen. Her journey wasn't just about getting revenge. It was about reclaiming her identity and her power in a world that tried to render her invisible. Marcus and Chloe learned the hard way that true success isn't built on arrogance and disrespect, but on integrity and vision qualities Isabella had in spades. Her victory wasn't just in her success, but in her freedom. If this story of triumph and karma resonated with you, please hit that like button to let us know. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. We have so many more stories of justice empowerment and incredible twists coming your way, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thank you for listening.